ora tātou, and welcome to our webinar this evening. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Anne Meade and Meg Kwan from Daisies Early Education and Care Centre in Wellington. Welcome to you both.
Hi, thank you for having us again.
Yes, kia ora
It's great to have you back. It's great to have you back. I will introduce you formally. We had Anne and Meg on just a few weeks ago, and it was so successful that we wanted to invite them back. But if you weren't able to attend that webinar, let me tell you just a little bit about Daisies, first of all. Daisies caters for 60 children aged from 0 through to 6, over 2 buildings, and it's an award-winning centre. It's won awards for its Nature Explore programme. It's been accredited at silver level with schools, and it's rated as very well placed by ERO to deliver quality education and care. And then Anne, Dr. Anne Meade, is a pedagogical leader at Daisies. Anne's been focused on early childhood education for most of her career, as I'm sure you all know. She's been a teacher, a researcher, a lecturer, an author, and a policy developer. And Meg Kwan is an education leader at Daisies, and she's a full-time kayaker, been working today, currently teaching the 3 and overs, and she is passionate about ongoing learning. So we're just really delighted that you're both able to join us this evening. And as I say, this is a follow-up webinar. We've also Anne and Meg have created some resources also to supplement this webinar and your understanding of what it is that they're doing at Daisies. So if you check the chat box in a minute, we'll be putting up a link to a document that they've written for us, which explains some of the background and some of the practicalities of how this approach to intentional teaching and investigations works for them at Daisies. So thank you very much for that. That's an awesome resource. Okay, so tonight we're talking about intentional teaching through and with investigations, and so let's start with this term intentional teaching, because it's essential to what you're trying to do through investigations, isn't it? What do you understand by the term intentional teaching?
Maybe if I start. So
thanks, Anne.
Kia ora koutou. I see it as a mindset. So it's perhaps a little bit different from people that think what it is didactic teaching. It's not. It's a mindset that kayako carry through what they're doing in their planning, in their practice daily with the tamariki, in the way they set up the environment and so on. So it's a mindset that the goal is through interactions largely that the children's learning, development and thinking is extended, is expanded upon. I don't know whether Meg wants to add something more on that one. That's a starter from me.
Yeah,
Thank you, Anne.
I was just going to say, I think alongside that mindset, it's really valuing what we bring as teachers to the table, not just what the tamariki already bring, but what a useful resource we are in a centre and what the important part that we play in that role of their learning. Yeah.
I'm picking up from you both that it's really about highlighting that those interactions and what the teacher can be doing, whereas I think in the past we've often thought about responding to children through the environment rather than actually with our own person. Would you agree? That's just what I've picked up that I'm hearing from you.
Yes, absolutely. And there has been a shift. So in earlier times, the developmentally appropriate practice that was the buzzword for decades in a way was that you just set up the environment and then you observe. Whereas as we've understood more about learning and learning of young children as well as learning for adults, we realise how important it is for people to come together and interact in order to expand their learning and their development and their thinking. And it's throughout Te Whāriki when you look at what's there in Te Whāriki, or in the red pages, what's the role and responsibility of the teachers. It's quite explicit about intentional teaching, but it's there when you look at what you're strengthening the children. The Te Whāriki is based on the concept of mana, on strength, and all 5 strands of Te Whārihi really puts responsibility back to teachers to strengthen children, strengthen them through their communication, through their explorations, through resilience for well-being. So one of the things that we're noted for at Daisies is the Nature Explore programs into the bush, and that's an incredibly powerful way of and the interactions that we have. We could not, the children could not achieve what they achieve on our local mountain, Tarikaka, if we weren't really mindful in our interactions to bring through their resilience and their care for each other in a quite different environment and quite challenging environment actually, and so on. So it's there throughout Te Whārihi. It's there in the way that we use Te Whārihi in the Daisies context, both in the centre but also when we're out in nature.
I think it's really nice as well to hear about, you know, the prominence of the teacher, and it kind of gives us a bigger role than perhaps, you know, we've downplayed our own role a little bit in the past. So so thank you for that. At Daisies, part of your curriculum focuses on planned investigations for children and teachers, which the children and teachers explore together. Can you tell us more about that? What prompted you to start working in that particular way with children?
Well, I'm one of the founders of Daisies, and it's been there right from the beginning in our philosophy of practice that we were going to do investigations as one of the hallmarks, I think we say in our philosophy. And if we're going to be doing investigations, then you're going to be doing some intentional teaching. Again, I want to emphasize that's not sitting down necessarily in instruction, but the intentional teaching is woven through all that we do in the settings, in the parts of the program that are to do with our investigations, but it's there in other ways as well. And I'm thinking back over my own period of time as a researcher and my own work with schema learning theory, and I was fortunate enough to spend quite a bit of time with Chris Athy and Tina Bruce in the UK that wrote the key books about that. And Chris in particular was very, very clear in the times that I spent with her. You don't just observe, you actually take it forward when you see that children seem to have a schematic thread in their thinking. Then it's beholden on the teachers to take that forward, provide vocabulary, take it through. Don't just go, oh look, I can see. Yeah, so it's been in Daisy's practice, philosophy of practice, right from the beginning that we will have intentional teaching. We've developed it our own way. We're influenced by Reggio Emilia practice and pedagogy. Several of us at Daisies have had quite a lot of contact with professional learning in Reggio Emilia, but we've done our own ways forward with that. But that's their approach has got a lot of intentional teaching, not all day long either, but we've and is connected strongly to thinking through really how can you enrich children's learning and have them light up with their own learning and thinking. And I think for me, that's one of the joys of my experiences with Reggio Emilia approaches, both here in Daisies, but what I've observed in Melbourne and in Reggio Emilia city itself is seeing the children's joy and their eyes light up with them understanding, you know, learning to learn. And that learning to learn is probably one of the key reasons for doing investigative approaches to learning and intentional teaching, so that you're actually handing children or gifting them some very precious dispositions as being researchers, investigators themselves, absolutely feeding them their curiosity and taking their curiosity forward. And that's what we aim to do.
Thank you. You've also answered a question I had around, what are the outcomes for children? And I think it's very clear there's some real strong and positive outcomes that very much reflect what Te Whariki itself is all about. So thank you. So how exactly do investigations support teachers to be intentional? And perhaps you could give us an example here. I don't know, Meg, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, sure. So just with what Anne was saying before, one of the things that drew me to Daisies, in a teaching capacity, is the depth of learning that children manage to obtain through these investigations, and some of the questions and the concepts that they end up exploring because they're given that chance to take everything a little bit further. A really big part of my learning as a teacher at Daisies has been seeing the potential in children's questions or in their wonderings and in their interests, and not just taking it at face value, actually going, hey, here's something we could really explore, and we could take that further, and you could get all these opportunities to learn life-worthy learning concepts out of this. And that's definitely still a work in practice for me as well. But it's, definitely one of those things is just recognizing all the potential in the centre as it happens, and learning how to move forward with that and help children reach those potentials.
So could you give us an example of something you picked up from children that then became an investigation?
Yeah, so about a year or maybe 2 years ago now, and I'm using this example just because I was working with under twos at the time, and we'll have some examples for over twos as well, but just we do investigations with the whole age range, and I think that's quite important to note as well, that it's not just limited to that older group. But one of the questions we had for our whole centre investigation was around tarikaka te maunga, so our maunga in our area and our awa. And I was working with under twos, and we looked at them in context of the question and said, look, we're not going to be exploring, I guess, specific aspects of what it means to have a mountain or that sort of thing, but we're looking at the basics. So we're looking at getting to build a relationship with the nature or with the water, the awa, and that sort of thing. And so we looked at children's interests at the time, and we picked up on water was definitely the thing that linked to their interests and to the investigation question. And we sort of stepped back and said, right, how can we take this forward? And we thought, actually, what we want to know is why they're interested in water. What is the one thing that draws them all to that, or is it something different for each individual child? And it was quite a process doing that, but it was really interesting, and the children really led that. So we'd seen the interest in terms of their explorations in the bathroom, classic 2-year-olds, the taps and the toilets and all sorts, and you're drinking water in your puddles outside, and it was always straight into the awa when we went on Nature Explore. There was no I want to roll around in the grass or find out about what the mud is about. It's straight in the water. And so that was really interesting for us. We're oh, what is it about that draws them to this constantly? So we did we set up a range of provocations, and we were very intentional in our timing, making sure that we had enough teachers available, and we communicated with the whole team hey, we want to do this experience now. We're going to put the water tray out in this space, and we're going to have 2 tamariki come in and just do whatever they want. Let them sort of go for gold with that. And that didn't last too long. And then we gave them resources to play with as well, and noticed there was a real interest in all resources pouring and that movement, those water wheels you get that spin, that sort of thing. And we're okay, maybe it's the movement of water and that flexibility, that tactile nature of it that gives them that interest. And then we were actually out on a Nature Explore, and the tamariki at this stage were just learning first words type thing. And we were near the awa, but we couldn't see it. And our wow moment for this investigation was this, like, she's like 16 months maybe at the time, and she was like, water, and she said it, and she couldn't even see it, but she could hear it. And we went, maybe it's the sound. Like, it was just this one child going like water before we could even see it, but knowing that she recognized that sound and she could hear it and she had that familiarity. And so then we did this moving water experience, and we had a hose over a shade sail, and had the water constantly dripping down. And
sounds fun. Yeah, brilliant.
There was a lot of prep in terms of making sure that we had changes of clothes ready. But no, and they engaged with that for ages. Like, that was by far the most interested they had been in a long-term experience with that. And they really valued, it was being able to hear it moving and having that going. And so we actually moved the investigation once we'd had this wow moment into like, what can we do next? Like, how can we grow that interest? And we looked at expression, and being able to express themselves through art and express this interest of theirs through art and giving them that tool. So we played some water sounds. This is very rushed, like a very version, but played them some water sounds, and we did painting to water. And so they could hear the water sounds and they knew what it was, and they showed us and told us that they knew what that was. And we invited them to sort of paint what they were hearing. It was a sort of a miss on our part. They sort of viewed the whole experience as very separate. So they were like, yep, I can hear the water, and now I'm going to go and do some painting. And so we sort of went back to the drawing board with that. And a lot of our investigations are like that. Like, you think you've got like this great idea planned, and you invite them to come and have a go. And some of them are like, yeah, and some of them are like, nah. And then they do something completely different. And you're like, okay, that was not quite where we thought you might take that. And we realized actually that was probably a bit too abstract for our under twos, and went back to the drawing board and sort of said, okay, how can we draw them to this interest of being able to express an idea specifically? And it was really cool. We actually got them to create their own water sounds. So they each had a turn individually sitting in the water tray. And we did an audio recording of them splashing around and laughing and playing. And we played it back to them straight away. So they knew that that was their sounds, and they understood what we were doing with that recording. And then it was really cool. We came back to them later and we revisited those audios a few times, so they knew what was happening, and they talked about it, and they'd mimic the motions and things. And then we gave them the paint, and we played that sound to them as well. We said, "Can't you paint what you hear? Like, what were you doing?" And we saw a lot of really expressive artwork from that. Like, they were much more engaged with that sound and putting that into their paintings, and you could see that in their faces. And there was lots of like mimicking their actions with the paint, and like making that sort of connection as well, and representing that.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it was really cool. It was amazing to see them grow to understand that they could express what they were hearing in a visual manner.
But also for you as teachers to learn about their thinking processes, and you know how you misjudged it sometimes. And I think that's really good for everyone listening to hear that this is not that there has to be a lot of room for trial and error and sort of going backwards and forwards in an investigation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think after the fact, it's quite easy to like put it in some sort of chronological order. But at the time, it's not how it happens at all. It's sort of all over the place, and one child might be still experiencing just water on its own, and another child is like, no, I need that movement. I need the resources to get me engaged here. And so it is. It's paced not evenly, I guess.
There's a couple of strands to that. There's a lot of uncertainty in what we're doing. We don't set off to do and say on week 1 we're doing this, week 2, week 3, and we've got the whole month planned out. So we really are listening and watching, observing children's play, and watching what sparks their interest or not, in what we do. I think the other aspect is that we're researching, as teachers, we're researching our approaches constantly. So it's an investigation on 2 levels, and the Reggio Emilia people talk about that quite a bit, that the adults are researching their pedagogy as the children are researching whatever it is. So in that case, it was the movement and sound of water. I look back over some of the documentation we've had, and it's another one about out in nature, actually. Well, we are an enviro school after all. I've got I can show you this. You just be up. No, that doesn't work too well. But there was some wondering at the middle, in the middle, the wondering by just the adults wondering, it says. What makes Nico children, this was toddlers as well actually, so excited and so keen about gardening? So our garden, where we do actually get out and get dirty in the garden, is adjacent to the car park in Daisies. So it's a bit of a special experience. So we want to know, is this, you know, because they don't often get to be outside in the car park. Is it about watering the plants? Is it about, what is it? That the children get really excited. They, yes, 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 if you mention going out and doing the gardening. So what was it? And so the teachers did plan a period of time to just try out different things. Is it about watering? Is it about the space, which is a little bit unusual? What is it? Is it about the plants themselves and getting into the garden? And so they took them out and observed them 2 or 3 times. And then what the children zeroed in on was that we had some, I think we had a kawakawa shrub adjacent to that, and they noticed there were holes in the leaves. And they started to be interested in the insects in the garden. So it wasn't, the children themselves moved in their interest to the holes in the leaves, and they wanted to know, and then they were upset about that. And what could they do? And just to jump to the end point, was they invented a solution to this, that we should have something that would scare the insects away. Some stories were read. Yes, scarecrows seemed like a good idea, and in the end, the children made Ella the scarecrow. She is very tattered now, but she's still on our fence. She's lost her stuffing in her tummy and things like that. But they got together, and that said, like Meg talked about, how it can go into different experiences. In the end, the children actually, some of the children learned to use a sewing machine, and the Ella the scarecrow is quite life-sized object, and they sewed and stuffed Ella, and the dad came along and installed Ella onto the fence of Daisy. So it's constantly moving, a moving thing of observing, listening, researching, how and watching the children's interest, what really grabs them, and the light in the eye clues that give us about where we might land, so that it is a child interest that we're proceeding with.
But I imagine that this eye lighting up moment is also just very motivating for teachers and makes teachers' work really interesting. I want to pause now and just invite people that are watching tonight, if they want to send in their questions. I'm going to try and ask as many as I can. While people are typing, I just wanted to ask a little bit about the systems that underpin this way of working. I know you've a lot of this is covered in the resource that we mentioned at the beginning that you've written for the Education Hub. But I wondered if you could tell us briefly about the systems that make this possible. And for example, is this quite a separate process from your general planning, or you held up a book, Anne? Would that book just be for the investigation planning? How does the investigation planning occur?
We although in the last 2 to 3 years we've had a whole centre investigation, the planning is done in smaller groups.
Right.
It has to in an early childhood centre, a long day centre. We don't have time after, say, a kindergarten session to do the planning. So this is one small group. Each group has got, just uses an art folio type book, and that's got the mind maps, and it's the adult wondering and what should we try out, and then it's got a big tick it's what makes the holes in the leaves and why, and what can we do about it. It's got a big tick in the group. That's what they were going to move forward on. We decided that we were going to try and do larger, more life-worthy investigations, and we tried it, and it didn't work. We couldn't seem to get it moving forward, and so we did quite a major internal evaluation, and the outcome of that was decided that we had to create times for small groups of teachers to do planning, but the educational leadership team, which is myself and Rachel Dene, the other pedagogical leader, the two head teachers, this is now the two head teachers and the two education leaders, and Meg is one of the education leaders. But we decided that through that internal evaluation that we had to rejig our staff use of non-contact time, basically. And that if this was a priority for us, then we needed to make more time for planning. So each small group now has some time each week to plan for the investigations. We've put in there that's not all that they do. So they might have that planning time, and they might devote it to helping what else might they do? Well, we're planning at the moment, even though we're semi in lockdown and semi not. But we have workshops and conversations with families, one-on-one conversations. So we'll put some time aside for other sorts of planning, about a workshop for parents planning and so on. But probably 50% of the time of those small group planning times are devoted to investigation planning. So there's usually one of the educational leadership team might sit and mentor in those meetings. It can last up to often it's only about an hour and a half, and then the team might go away and actually do something fairly immediately to put a plan into action. And the head teacher, they don't sit in the office, and when those planning meetings are going on, the head teachers are out. They're either supporting a small group planning, doing their planning, or they are actually in teaching mode, so that there's enough staff to keep the ratios up. And we keep books, and we share on Story Part. We share the plans that are being made. And at the team hui, which are fortnightly in the evenings, we'll do a catch-up round at least once a month about how it's going, what the small groups are doing. So there's some writing that people can refer to that's posted on Story Part for all the teachers to see. There's writing in these books that the small groups come back to. What did we say we were going to do? How did that work? Because they write their evaluative reflections in there too. And
at what stage do you weave in the learning outcomes of Te Whariki?
That can vary. So it's there as our research question for the current one that we're just about wrapping up. But at other times we'll come back, and it might be that the learning outcomes are expressed as an indicator. So we often, when we've decided what's going forward for the next little while, and we might write an intent from it, then we'll write some, we call them indicators actually, but they generally are learning outcomes from Te Whariki. So this is what we hope to see. But it keeps shifting, as Meg was saying, it keeps shifting. So the learning outcomes went from vocabulary almost about and recognizing that through to some learning outcomes towards expressive communication. We're not staying, and this might be the occasion that I'll pull up with some thing. We're not clear at the beginning, and we're often not clear at other times quite where we're going, but we do want to stay within the path. So if New Zealanders will recognise this is the Rakaia River. It's a braided river. Braided rivers are fairly unique to New Zealand, actually. So we're all heading in the direction toward the sea, if you like, along this, but it meanders down different paths, and sometimes children can go right off over here somewhere and do their own thing. Or sometimes they'll be with a bigger group, and we're moving it through and down the path. So yes, we may set up a set of learning outcomes quite early on, and we'll keep coming back to them, but at other times it might shift as the children's interest shifts, and our research about what's worked and what's really brought the light in the eye, the shining eyes, going forward, and what the children seem to be really interested to think about and learn more about, then we might insert another learning outcome then.
Okay. Also, people are quite interested in how you document all of this. So all this, how you document a group investigation. Meg, do you want to answer?
Sure.
Yeah.
So there's a range of documentation. So Anne's mentioned a few there. In terms of teacher documentation, like for our own keeping track of investigations, most of us use what we call the Black Book, and it's just one of those A3 art portfolio books, and we document meeting minutes, plans, things that we see potential in and where they might go, and ideas that for experiences that we might put forward, as well as outcomes. And we often have that book with us in Hui as well, and like are writing down children's dialogue as we see it. If we have like a moment, we're like, oh, you haven't asked something like this before, and we'll make a note in the Hui book there. So we've got a written record, I guess, of the investigation over that period of time. We also have the story park planning function, which all the teachers can access. So you're able to sort of have a fair handle on what the other groups are doing as well. And you can see links and overlaps between your investigations there. And then in terms of documenting and sharing with parents, it's both a mix of story park and verbal. We try to be careful not to overload with group stories that aren't necessarily specific to a child, but still making sure that parents are getting a general overview of what is happening, and then getting the wow moments for the individual children too. And often, like with the example I gave before of our investigation with the younger children, at the end, we decided we'd write a summary story for each individual child, and it was sort of this lovely summary of their growth over that period of time, but specifically related to the investigation. So some children went from being really interested in watching their friends be in the water to absolutely loving in the water, like getting in the water themselves and you not being able to get them out again type thing. And so we did a summary for each child at the end of that investigation to celebrate their individual learning within that.
Okay. And so you have a sort of one theme for investigation, but there are actually slightly different investigations going on for each group of children.
Yes.
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 And the planning is in the Black Book, but is there any planning on the wall for families to see as they enter the centre, or any other?
Yeah, so we often use wall displays as a way of interacting with parents, but also for the children to interact with. We try and make sure that they are accessible and it's a way for them to revisit experiences too. And there'll often be maybe like a snippet or a post of dialogue that's aimed at parents that says, hey, this is where we're at the moment. We noticed this and this is what we're doing. And then pictures to accompany that allow the children to access that information as well. Yeah, and that changes. We try and keep it up to date. Sometimes it slips behind, but we try and keep that up to date so you can see that progress in the investigation as well. Yeah.
And the plans and the notes that you write in Story Park, are those just for the other teachers to read, or are they also for families?
They're mostly for teachers. We did for a period of time try sharing the Story Park plans with parents, and we just found that we didn't get as much engagement as we might have expected from that. and spoke to parents, and actually they sort of felt that they were getting overwhelmed with that. But I think that would be very specific to the group of parents that you have, and tailored to each centre as to how much engagement parents want to know about planning. And we found that our parents have quite a good hold on our investigation process, just from sharing with us verbally. Like we're quite keen to share our practice, I guess, and what we're all about and the learning outcomes that we have for children. And so parents are aware of the progress and the process that we go under, and they sort of follow their own child's journey, but they don't feel the need necessarily at our centre to have every week's planning.
We painted one wall in the centre of one of the houses. We haven't got a similar board where we are, and we call it the investigation. It's a whiteboard. We painted it with whiteboard paint, and so we have at times put that up, had the question on that and progress on that, but as well we've got some other display boards that we might put, well, what's going on for the babies in this investigation, and might put that on the board inside of the baby space. So there are things, and we do have the workshops for parents every 6 to 8 months, and generally the little workshop part of that evening gives an update on what the investigation is and where it's up to.
I know we talked last time in our last webinar about some strategies for getting the family's input into planning, and I think you also talk about that in the document too that you've written for us. Somebody's asked, I think this is a great question, what do you mean, Anne, by a life-worthy investigation?
Oh, right. We try and find something that isn't too can't even say it, and I haven't had a glass of wine, much as I might have liked to have. Superficial. We don't want something superficial that children are going to pick up anyway. Colours or vehicles and names of vehicles or something like that. We do try and find something that what's another term for life-worthy? Really important. So the one that the Awa one was part of the wider study of our local maunga, Tarikaka, and the Awa, the Waitohi in particular there. But we were trying to develop in the children a sense of kaitiakitanga, of guardianship of that mountain, and a sense as well of Turenga Waiwai. This is their part of Wellington to feel really attached to. That's an example, I suppose. Other ones, I think I talked briefly last time about what makes us say yum or yuck about food, but is to develop an appreciation of good food. We are what we call a full service early childhood centre, so we have a cook who cooks a hot meal each day, and we're threading through what we're doing, and our cooks over the years have been fabulous actually in working with the children and understanding more about nutrition and healthy eating and so on. So we've done some investigations about healthy eating. We are an enviro school, so there's a lot about sustainability.
So those help you to sort of select an area of focus.
Yeah. So we might have a focus on recycling and recycling. Well, at the moment, one of the, and it's a separate strand that actually illustrates, we aren't all focused on the whole investigation, but we keep moving along with composting and a worm farm and things to do with gardening, because we're an enviro school.
How do you ensure that sort of the investigation suits all children's interests, and what would you do, for example, if there were children who weren't interested in an investigation?
That's totally fine. If they're not interested in that, then that's just how that is. And it's up to the key teacher to sort of decide when in an investigation you feel you might best be able to draw their interests into it and invite them to come into that space. We're often really surprised. There'll be a child that's got friends that are really interested in the investigation, but then themselves haven't yet felt an interest in the experiences that we're putting forward. And so they've sort of sat on the sidelines and they've observed, but they've not necessarily engaged themselves. And we're often really surprised with how much information they've drawn just from being on the sidelines. And then when they feel the moment is right, they'll ask a question, or the teachers will maybe set up an experience that's linked to that life-worthy learning that we've talked about in the investigation, but is more along the lines of that child's specific interest, and draw them into it that way. But we don't feel that we have to have all the tamariki involved all the time. And that's sort of what that river that Anne showed us before represents, is the ability for it to take 1,000 different paths, and for some children to be really interested in some aspects and some to be really interested in others, and then don't have to all be on the journey all the time together. And that's sort of how we also allows us to keep that momentum going. And their interest and their learning is still happening. We still have all these other experiences that happen throughout the day, and their free play experience as well.
I think that's really important to mention, that people understand that there are lots of other opportunities to work with children and to plan for children on an individual level. That's something that happens in your centre too, isn't it?
Yes, we have a key teacher system, and their responsibility is to make sure that both they know the interests of the children and they respond to those interests, but they also keep an eye on the gaps that they might have in the richness of their learning, and they notice and recognise gaps, not just the actual learning, but the gaps in the learning, and do something about that.
Thank you. And are there opportunities for children of different ages to come together? I mean, how separate are these investigations? I'm aware that you have the two houses, so that you have, physical separation between your infants and toddlers and older children. But how would someone go about using this kind of approach in a mixed age setting?
Well, we have our separate age groups, but we're very much mixed in the houses. There's no specific space for any group or other, apart from Kuramiko, who are our youngest, our babies, and they just need that safe, quiet space. But there's lots of crossover, and if a child is not in my rōpū, so I'm a whānaki, if someone from Rimu is showing a definite interest in our investigation, then they're more than welcome to enter, and we make sure that we're communicating as a team about where the children's interests are at, and whether that's something that we can weave our investigations together and have a shared hui or some shared experiences that allow them to overlap, or whether we invite that child to those experiences that are relevant to their interests or things that they've shown an interest in learning about. So we try, and one of the questions on our story park planning is actually, how can we work with other rōpū? Like, what are the opportunities that we see here to cross even between houses? And we talk about, that tuakana taina is often really important, and it's a really good way of solidifying our own learning and their own learning as teaching others as well. So being able to share their learning with younger children is often something that comes up as an idea of a way of merging those age groups too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you try to fit everything into this broad investigation? So you've got children with quite different interests, maybe quite different needs. Does everything have to fit in? Does every learning outcome have to be related to this investigation on the water? Because that makes it all very complicated, doesn't it? Whereas I think if we separate these two things out, investigations is something that you do for some part of the day, and uninterrupted play and teachers responding in intentional ways to children hopefully happens quite a lot during the day.
So Meg's talked about hui, and that's when one or more of the teachers in a particular rōpū, in a particular small team, might work with the children on an experience that might extend their interest in it. But that's only that group at that time, and it might be only about 15 minutes, but it might be much bigger than that, and especially if it's an excursion experience, like going to the library or something, or going on Nature Explore, then it will be much longer than that. But it might be quite a brief hui, small group time, with the adult being very planful and thoughtful about taking the learning forward. And the rest of the day, that kayako will, yes, keep an eye on it and maybe refer back to what was done, but the rest of the time that kayako is joining in generally, or with thinking about their own key children and might want to get alongside their key children. And each teacher has between 5 and 7, is that right, Meade? Yeah, key children, that they are the go-to person for the child and the go-to person for the family. So, you know, they've got a special relationship, and will keep parents informed about how the child's learning is progressing. So, you know, they'll follow up and go, well, I know you're interested in carpentry, and carpentry may have nothing whatsoever to do with the investigation. But
that's okay.
It's okay. We'll put the carpentry going, or Meg's taken off as a gardener, and we've got some garden boxes, and she'll take the children out to harvest some things and do a little bit of cooking with what's been harvested off the tomato plants and so on. So, you know, it's not all tightly tied to the investigation.
Okay, thank you. We're rapidly running out of time, and I'm just going to choose one last question to ask you from, I'm sorry we didn't get through all the questions tonight again. How do you encourage all your kayako to embrace this working collaboratively, this way of working? Because it sounds fabulous. I'd love to work at Daisies. But, you know, how have you created this culture of such excitement over following children's learning?
It's there right from the interview.
Yeah.
What one of the key characteristics that we're looking for.
So being really clear in what it is that you want to do. That philosophy, I suppose, comes.
We want people who are thirsty to learn. One of our 4 values is enthusiasm for learning, and we're looking out for that in people joining the team. And it's a big part of the induction period of time for the teachers too.
Meg, what would you say about, because part of your role as education leader is kind of to oversee this work, but to enthuse teachers around this work. Any strategies that you have for that?
Taking a moment to step back and look at all the awesome stuff that's happening.
Yeah.
has been really helpful for me, but also like that I've seen across the team. It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day stuff and just feel like you've got things to tick off your list, and you've got this investigation, and you've got your key children, and you've got all the routines and rituals that happen every day as well. But when you stop and step back and go, look at, this is where we started in our investigation, and this is where we are now, and that child wasn't contributing, they weren't confident maybe to contribute in the group at all, and now we can't get them to stop talking. And it's looking at those moments of growth for the children as well, and stopping, just taking time to appreciate where you're at and where you've come from has been a really big one, and making sure that you see the work that you're putting into it and not getting caught up in the day-to-day. The wow moments that we said about where
the eyes lit up.
That's a really driving force, I think. Like when you see a child like have this wow moment and they get something, or they're like really enthused about something, you pick up on that as well, and you ride with that as well, and that's a really that's a driving factor, I think.
Thank you so much. I just want to conclude by saying clearly there's so much interest in your way of working, but I think if teachers review this webinar and our past webinar, we'll put some links up. Also the document that I mentioned, we've got a document just sort of explaining a bit more about how Daisies works and what are the sort of systems and the ideas, principles behind, you know, how Anne and Meg and their team get this to work at Daisies. And I know this is the kind of information that a lot of people are asking around. Also, if you're interested in the idea of the mindset of intentional teaching, thanks Anne for that that way of understanding intentional teaching. We do have a resource online at the Education Hub about intentional teaching, more along the lines of supporting individual children. And that's a question. Those are questions coming up as well. So I hope that you're able to find some answers there. Thank you so much. I'm going to finish with that metaphor of the braided river. It was so wonderful that we could. I feel we've used that in this webinar tonight. We've sort of kept the thread of the investigation. We've looked at some other areas alongside that, and it was just nice to have our part of the river here at Education Hub join with your part of the river at Daisies for a wee while and share some of your expertise and knowledge and joy, actually, of working with children. So thank you very much, Anne. Thank you, Meg, and hopefully we'll see you again on the Education Hub soon.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.